My mother used to iron her uniform even on the mornings she had a fever. She'd stand at the board in the laundry room at 5 a.m., pressing the creases into her scrubs until they were sharp enough to cut paper, even when her hands were shaking. She did that for 22 years, not because the hospital required it, because she believed that if you were going to show up for someone on the worst day of their life, you ought to look like you meant to be there. Her name is Joanna, and she raised me and my younger brother on a pediatric nurse's salary in a 2-bedroom rental in Dayton, Ohio, after my father left when I was 11. She never complained about the apartment. She never complained about the car that needed a new alternator every other winter, or the years she wore the same 2 pairs of shoes until the soles came loose. She complained about exactly one thing once in all the years I was growing up, and it was this. She told me when I was 19 that she'd always wanted to live somewhere with a porch. Not a balcony, not a stoop. A real porch, she said, wide enough for 2 rocking chairs. I filed that away. I don't know exactly when it became a plan, but somewhere around my 30th birthday it stopped being a thought and started being a line item. My name is Faye, and I'm 34 years old. I work as a project manager at a mid-sized logistics firm in Cincinnati, and I have spent the last 4 years doing something that most of my coworkers would consider aggressively boring. I have not upgraded anything. Not my car, which is a 2017 Honda with a crack in the passenger side mirror. Not my apartment, which is a 1-bedroom I've rented since I was 28. Not my vacations, which consisted of 3 long weekends at my college roommate's cabin in Kentucky and 1 work conference in Atlanta where I mostly ate from the hotel vending machine. My husband, Owen, knew about the account. He knew what it was for. He is the kind of person who, when I explained what I was doing and why, simply nodded and said, "Okay, I'll keep my overtime separate so it doesn't blur things." He didn't try to talk me out of it. He didn't suggest we use the money for a down payment on a house for us instead. He understood, because Owen has met my mother, and anyone who has spent more than 40 minutes with Joanna understands immediately what kind of person she is and what kind of person she made. My mother's 25th work anniversary at Cincinnati Children's was the event I chose. Not a round number birthday, not a holiday. Her anniversary, because she once told me offhand that the hospital used to give out pins for service milestones, and she thought it was funny that the most recognition you got for a quarter-century of caring for sick children was a pin the size of a dime. I wanted to give her something that couldn't fit in an envelope. 8 months before the anniversary date, I found a house in Claremont County, small town 40 minutes east of the city, 3 bedrooms, a half-acre lot, updated kitchen, and a porch. A wide, deep wraparound porch with a ceiling fan and room for not just 2 rocking chairs but 6, with space to spare. The listing price was $318,000. Between my dedicated savings account, a personal loan I qualified for on my own credit, and a small amount I borrowed from my 401(n), which my financial advisor strongly advised against and which I did anyway, I closed on it 11 weeks later. I put it in my mother's name. Just hers. That was deliberate. My brother Kevin, who lives in Columbus, was in on it from the beginning. He handled the furniture delivery, coordinated with the sellers about an extended walk-through window, and drove down the week before to help me set things up. We hung photos in the hallway. We bought the rocking chairs ourselves, 2 of them, cushioned, facing the front yard. We stocked the pantry with things my mother likes. Good coffee, a particular brand of crackers she's bought her whole life, the kind of orange marmalade you can only find at one specific grocery chain. Kevin put a bird feeder on a pole near the porch railing, because our mother has fed birds in every yard she's ever had access to, even when she was renting. The plan was that Kevin would drive her down on a Saturday morning under the pretense of looking at an investment property on behalf of a friend of mine who lived out of state and couldn't make the trip. My mother was practical enough to find this plausible. She'd been helping Kevin think through buying his first property for almost a year. She'd believed she was there to advise. Owen and I had driven out the night before. His parents, Frank and Gretchen Alderholt, had offered to come Saturday morning to help with the final setup, while I drove back to pick up Kevin and my mother from a meeting point about 20 minutes away, since my car was the one my mother recognized. I thought this was generous. I said yes. That was the mistake. I want to be honest about my relationship with Owen's mother before I go further, because I think the temptation in situations like this is to paint someone as a cartoon, and Gretchen Alderholt is not a cartoon. She is a specific kind of woman, intelligent, socially polished, and absolutely convinced that her family operates on a slightly elevated plane from most people around them. She has never said this directly, she doesn't have to. It's in the way she surveys a room when she enters it, the slight pause before she compliments anything that belongs to someone outside her immediate orbit. The careful, pleasant way she asks questions that are really assessments. She never liked that Owen married me. She never said so. What she said at our rehearsal dinner was that she was so glad Owen had found someone so grounded. She said it the way you'd describe a sensible shoe. In 6 years of marriage, she had made comments about the neighborhood we lived in, about my mother's profession. Nursing is so important. The backbone of the system. Really, not everyone can handle something so hands-on. And once, at a Christmas dinner, about how refreshing it was that not everyone needed to make a grand show of their lives. I had absorbed all of it because Owen always said he'd talk to her, and because I genuinely believed that what I was doing for my mother was entirely separate from the Alderholts and had nothing to do with them at all. I was 30 minutes away, driving toward Kevin's car in a Kroger parking lot, when Owen called me. His voice was careful in the way that it gets when he's trying not to alarm me before he understands something himself. He said, "Hey, can you tell me what furniture you ordered for the living room?" I told him. The tan sectional, the oval coffee table, the lamp from the local shop in Milford. He was quiet for a second. Then he said, "Okay. Because there's a gray sectional in here, and a different lamp, and some boxes that aren't ours." I pulled into the Kroger lot next to Kevin's car and sat there for a moment with the engine running. "Where's your mom?" I asked. "She's on the porch," he said, and his voice had shifted into something I couldn't quite read. "She's been here since 7. She has a key." I told Kevin to wait with our mother. I said there was a small mix-up with the setup, and I needed to go handle it first. He looked at me with the kind of look younger brothers give you when they know you're understating something significantly, but he nodded. When I pulled into the driveway of my mother's house 20 minutes later, the first thing I noticed was that the bird feeder Kevin had installed was gone. The pole was still there, planted in the soil near the porch railing, but the feeder itself had been removed. I don't know why that detail hit me first. Maybe because it was so small. Maybe because it told me something about the level of attention that had gone into what was happening. Gretchen was sitting on the porch in one of the rocking chairs. My rocking chair. She had a travel mug of something, and she looked entirely at home. Frank was inside. Through the front window, I could see him moving around near the kitchen. And when I looked more carefully, I could see that the photos we'd hung in the hallway had been taken down. The walls were bare. A framed print I didn't recognize was leaning against the baseboard. Owen was standing in the front yard with his arms crossed and his jaws set, which is how I knew he'd already tried to have a conversation that had not gone the way he intended. Gretchen saw me pull up and raised her travel mug in a small wave. I didn't wave back. I got out of the car and walked to the porch steps, and she said, before I could say anything, "Faye, I'm glad you're here. I think there's been a communication breakdown and we should clear it up." "There's no breakdown," I said. "I need to understand what's happening in this house." She set her mug down on the armrest and folded her hands in her lap with the practiced patience of someone who has managed difficult conversations many times and won most of them. Frank and I talked to Owen several weeks ago about the possibility of having a place outside the city. Something the family could use, closer to nature, somewhere to bring the grandchildren when the time comes. She paused to let that land. The grandchildren comment was not accidental. "Owen mentioned you'd found something in the area. We assumed, given how long we've all been talking about wanting a family property." "Owen," I said, not to her, but to my husband standing in the yard. He walked over. "I mentioned to my dad that you'd found a property. I didn't tell them it was a gift for your mom. I didn't tell them anything about what it was for. I don't know how they got a key." He looked at his mother when he said the last part. Gretchen's expression didn't change. Exactly, but something in it settled, the way a mask settles when you press it. The realtor's lockbox was still on the door when we arrived. Frank used the code from the listing sheet. "The listing sheet," I said. Owen had a copy on his phone. He showed Frank the photos a few weeks ago when they were talking about. He showed him photos of a house I purchased. I said, "And your interpretation of that was that you should let yourselves in and start moving your belongings inside." The silence that followed was a particular kind of silence. It was the kind that happens when someone who has always won by controlling the framing of a conversation realizes the framing has left their hands. Frank appeared in the doorway behind her. He was a quieter man than Gretchen in most ways, but in that moment he looked like a man who was very aware that he had made a significant error and was hoping someone else would speak first. Owen stepped up next to me. I felt him before I saw him move, The shift of his weight, the decision behind it. He said, "Mom, whose name is on the deed to this property?" She looked at him. "I need you to answer that, Faye," she said. Clipped, unhappy. "Then, this is not a family property. This is Faye's property, which she bought with her own money for her own mother, for a reason that has nothing to do with us." He looked at his father. "Dad, did you think this was something we'd offered you?" His father took a breath. "Your mother seemed to think. I'm asking what you thought." Another breath. And then, slowly, he said, "I thought there might have been some discussion we weren't part of. Which was, I understood then, the truth under everything. They had not stumbled into this. They had seen an opportunity, a house Owen had mentioned, a lockbox code that was accessible, a Saturday morning when everyone else would be away, and they had moved into it the way Gretchen Alderholt had always moved into spaces she decided belonged to her family's future. Quietly, before anyone could say otherwise. It wasn't about a house. I want to be clear about that. It was about a pattern that had been in place since the week Owen brought me home to meet them, the assumption that his choices were extensions of their plans, that his life was a portfolio they managed. That a woman who grew up in a 2-bedroom rental in Dayton, whose mother ironed her scrubs at 5 a.m. with a fever, was a variable to be worked around rather than a person who had built something real. They had moved into my mother's house before she'd ever set foot in it. I went inside. I didn't say anything else to Gretchen. I walked past her, through the front door, and I started with the hallway. "The framed print that wasn't mine," I said on the porch. "The photos of my mother and father on their wedding day. The one of Kevin at his college graduation. The one of my mother holding me at the hospital. The day I was born. Those I picked up from where they'd been stacked on the floor, and I started hanging them back on the nails they'd been taken off of." Owen came in behind me. He picked up a box from the living room, a box I didn't recognize, full of things I'd never seen, and carried it out to his parents' car without a word. Then he came back and carried out another. Frank helped, eventually. He came in and picked up things quietly, not meeting anyone's eyes, and carried them out. His face was tight in a way that looked genuine, which made things both better and worse. Gretchen stayed on the porch for a long time. I could see her through the window, still sitting in the rocking chair, and at some point she stood up and walked to the railing and looked out at the yard in a way that might have looked contemplative to someone who didn't know what had just happened. Owen was on his 3rd or 4th trip out to the car. She watched him. When he came back in, she followed him to the door and said quietly, "I only wanted to make sure we had something we could count on. Things change, Owen. You don't always know what's coming." He stopped in the doorway. He looked at her for a moment with an expression I had never quite seen on his face before. Not anger, exactly, but something more tired and more final. "This was never something you could count on," he said. "It was never yours to count on. It was a gift from a daughter to her mother, and you walked into the middle of it like it was yours to take." He paused. "Please get the rest of your things and go." She opened her mouth. "I'll call you this week," he said. "We can talk then. Right now, I need you to go." They left 40 minutes later. Frank drove. Gretchen sat in the passenger seat, and she did not look back at the house as they pulled out, which I thought was its own kind of answer. When their car disappeared around the bend in the road, I stood in the front hallway for a moment and breathed. Then I called Kevin. He answered on the first ring. I could hear my mother in the background, laughing at something he'd said, completely unaware that anything had happened. She thought she was killing time before a property tour. She sounded the way she used to sound when she'd get a rare Saturday off, and would spend it doing nothing more urgent than drinking coffee and watching the birds at whatever makeshift feeder she'd managed to set up in whatever yard she had access to that year. "Bring her," I said. Kevin put the bird feeder back up before they arrived. He'd had the foresight to put it in his trunk when he drove out earlier that week, and while I was inside rehanging the last of the photos, I looked out the window and saw him standing in the yard with the pole, pressing it back into the soil, setting the feeder back on its hook. Something about watching him do that, my younger brother, who'd driven down twice in the same month to help me pull this off, made my throat tighten in a way that nothing else that morning had. The photos went back up. The gray sectional was gone, and my mother's sectional had never moved. The orange marmalade was still in the pantry. The rocking chairs were still on the porch, which was, at this point, the only thing on the porch. When Kevin's car turned into the driveway, I stood just inside the front door and watched through the sidelight window. My mother got out first. She was wearing a cardigan I recognized, forest green, slightly worn at the cuffs, the one she's owned since before I left for college. She looked around at the yard with the polite, evaluating expression of someone who's arrived to offer an opinion, and then she looked at the porch, and I watched the expression change. She stood there for a moment. Kevin had hung a banner across the porch railing while I was inside, simple, just white letters on a dark background. 22 years of showing up. You deserve to come home. Her anniversary at the hospital, her porch. She pressed one hand over her mouth. Kevin walked around the car and put his arm around her, and she turned into him the way people do when they're crying and trying not to make a sound, and he said something close to her ear that I didn't hear. Then she looked up and saw me in the doorway. I had not planned what I was going to say. I'd had an idea of it, of course, something about the account and the years of saving and what she'd given us and what I'd wanted to give back. But when she walked up the porch steps and I opened the door and she looked at me with her eyes red and her hand still pressed to her mouth, none of the planned words were there. What I said was, "It's yours, Mom. The porch is yours," which is not the speech I had prepared. But it was the right one. She pulled me in with both arms and held on, and I felt her breathing in the halting way you breathe when you're trying to collect yourself. And she smelled the same way she has always smelled, like the particular hand lotion she's bought from the same drugstore brand for 30 years. And I let her hold on as long as she needed. Kevin had brought grocery bags from the car. He'd added a few things to the pantry stock on his own, including a box of the wafer cookies my mother has served at every family gathering since I can remember, and a bottle of sparkling cider, which felt right for 11 a.m. on a Saturday. He put the kettle on without being asked because he knew she would want tea. We spent the rest of that morning on the porch. My mother walked through every room first, slowly, touching things. The countertops, the windowsills, the handles on the kitchen cabinets. She opened the back door and stood for a minute, looking at the half-acre of yard stretching out behind the house, already planning something. I could tell from her expression, a garden probably. Maybe a second feeder farther out. She went back to the porch and sat in one of the rocking chairs, and looked at the front yard and the road beyond it, and the tree line past that, and she rocked slowly, twice, and then she stopped rocking and just sat. Kevin and I sat in lawn chairs we'd unfolded from the garage and drank our coffee and didn't say much. The morning was warm and still in the particular way of late spring in southern Ohio, the kind of morning that would have been unremarkable in any other context. My mother said at some point, without turning to look at either of us, "I used to think, when you two were little, I used to think that the best I could do was make sure you didn't feel what I didn't have. That you didn't feel the gap." She paused. "I don't think I understood that you felt it too. And that you were going to do something about it." Kevin looked at me. I looked at him. "We watched you, Mom," he said. "We watched everything." She nodded at the yard. She didn't say anything else for a while. I called Owen to let him know how it had gone. He was back in Cincinnati by then, and when I told him about my mother standing on the porch with her hand over her mouth, he was quiet for a moment and then said, "Good. That's what it was supposed to look like." He sounded tired in a way that I recognized. The particular exhaustion of someone who has said something true and necessary to a person they love and knows there is more conversation still ahead. "Are you okay?" I asked. "I will be," he said. Today was the right day for what happened. He was not wrong. The conversation with his parents would be harder and longer, and it would require both of us. There were things that had been avoided for 6 years that would need to stop being avoided. Gretchen was not going to transform overnight into someone who understood where her authority ended. Frank was not going to suddenly offer accountability without being asked for it directly. Those were the realistic expectations, and I had them. But today had been its own thing. And what it had been was this. A house my mother had never expected, on a street she'd never driven down, with a porch she'd wanted for longer than she'd ever said out loud, now fully and legally and completely hers. Before I drove back that evening, I sat with her on the porch for another hour. The light had gone orange and long the way it does in early June in Ohio, and the birds were loud in the trees along the edge of the yard. A sound, she told me. She had been missing for 20 years of apartment living, the particular late-day sound of birds before they go quiet. The bird feeder was busy. She had already made a note on her phone of what kind of seed she'd need to buy. She hadn't cried again since the morning. She'd moved through the day with the steady, observant quiet that is just how she is, noticing everything, saying less than she's taking in. But just before I stood up to go, she said to me, "You know what I thought about today, in between everything?" I shook my head. I thought about how many mornings I drove to work thinking, just get through this one, and then the next one. And I thought about how many times I told myself it was enough to know I'd done the right thing, even if nobody ever. She stopped herself. I just want you to know I know. I know that's what this is. I didn't have anything to say that would have added to that, so I just sat with her for another few minutes and listened to the birds. The drive home felt different from the drive out. Not lighter, exactly. More like something that had been slightly off balance for a long time had finally settled into the right position. Not fixed. Some of what needed to be dealt with would take months, and I knew it. But the most important thing had happened the way it was supposed to happen, and the most important person had received what had been meant for her, and she was sitting on her porch in Claremont County at the end of a June evening, listening to birds she hadn't heard in 20 years. That was what I'd saved for. That was what the account labeled Mom had been for. Every spare dollar over 4 years, every skipped upgrade, every weekend I hadn't spent on a trip I could have afforded. Not so that she'd feel taken care of. She'd never needed that from me. So that she'd know we'd seen it all. Every early morning and worn-down shoe and grocery budget stretched across a week it wasn't designed to cover. Every year she'd told herself it was enough to do the right thing, even if no one ever said so. We'd seen it. And this was us saying so.